You know, just a few days ago, the introduction to this video was completely different. We're going to start by talking about how difficult it is to even have this conversation.
But the ground has shifted beneath our feet. In a historic and coordinated move, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, France, and Portugal have joined the ranks and formally recognized the state of Palestine. It's a seismic diplomatic shift that has been decades in the making.
And the Canadian government was incredibly blunt about why this is happening now. Their statement said the possibility of a two-state solution has been steadily and gravely eroded. They pointed directly to the current Israeli government's policies, stating it is working methodically to prevent the prospect of a Palestinian state from ever being established.
They also cited the unrelenting policy of settlement expansion and the devastating and preventable famine in Gaza as reasons for the decision. This massive movement, a coalition of key allies drawing a line in the sand, is essentially saying that the old path has failed.
And the backlash, it was instant. The Israeli embassy said the decision rewards Hamas, while U.S. Republicans called the international recognition a reckless policy. And that's why we need to be crystal clear about two things right from the start.
First, there is absolutely no place for anti-Semitism in this conversation, period. The horrific rise of anti-Semitic attacks we're seeing here in Canada and around the world is unacceptable. And it's essential to distinguish between criticizing the actions of the Israeli government and blaming Jewish people as a whole.
And second, Hamas is a terrorist organization. Their brutal attack on October 7th started this current, horrific chapter of violence. They oppress their own people, and they share fundamental responsibility for the suffering that we're seeing today.
You have to be able to hold both of those difficult truths at the same time to even begin to understand the full picture.
So it all just feels like this giant, tangled mess. The starvation, the politics, the history. You see these horrific images, but you don't know how to help, or even what to think.
And that is why understanding the history is more urgent than ever.
To understand today's headlines, and to have any hope of stopping this, you first have to understand how it all began. And to understand, you have to go back, way back.
Because the conflict didn't start with the Holocaust, it started with the fall of an empire.
For 400 years, the land of Palestine was part of the vast Ottoman Empire. But in the late 1800s, as the empire was weakening, two powerful nationalist movements were born, both laying claim to the same land.
First, in response to centuries of brutal anti-Semitism in Europe, the political movement of Zionism emerged. Its goal was to re-establish a national homeland for the Jewish people on their ancestral land. This led to the first waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine.
And the exact same time, a sense of Arab nationalism was sweeping the region. The Arab people, including those in Palestine, were demanding independence and the right to govern themselves after centuries of Ottoman rule.
So you have two peoples, two dreams of freedom focused on one small piece of land. And then World War I happens and everything explodes. The Ottoman Empire collapses and Great Britain takes control.
And this is where it gets incredibly messy. To win the war and control the Middle East, Britain made a series of contradictory promises to everyone. First, they promised Arab leaders independence if they helped fight the Ottomans. Then, they secretly promised the French that they would carve up the region for themselves.
And then came the most fateful promise of all, the 1917 Balfour Declaration. Britain publicly declared its support for establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
But there was a catch. The declaration also said the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities, who were at the time 90% of the population, must be protected. It was a promise that was fundamentally impossible to keep without causing conflict.
So for the next 30 years under the British mandate, that's exactly what happened. Britain facilitated Jewish immigration, which soared in the 1930s as Jews fled the Nazis in Europe. The growing Jewish population and land purchases led to riots, protests, and eventually the Great Arab Revolt of 1936. It was a brutal multi-year uprising against British rule that was violently crushed.
So, by the time World War II began, Palestine was already a powder keg of violence, broken promises, and two peoples in a desperate struggle for the same home. The British had created a problem that they couldn't solve. Then came World War II.
Between 1941 and 1945, 6 million Jews were systematically murdered by Nazi Germany. It was a genocide of unimaginable scale, born from hatred and lies that scapegoated an entire people.
And the world? For the most part, it stayed silent until it was too late. Countries, including Canada and the US, turned away ships of Jewish refugees, sending them back to their deaths. It was a global failure of conscience.
Sound familiar? A world looking away from a people suffering because it's easier, or just politically safer, to stay quiet.
So after the Holocaust, the world was drowning in guilt. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors in refugee camps with no homes, no country, and nowhere to go.
And into that void stepped Zionism. After the horrors of World War II, that goal became desperately urgent.
So the world, led by the newly formed United Nations, looked to British-controlled Palestine and said, "We need to fix this." And their solution? The 1947 Partition Plan.
So let's break down the numbers because they are critical. At the time, the Jewish population made up about 1/3 of the people in Palestine, and they owned less than 7% of the land. The UN plan, though, gave them 56% of the territory.
So you can imagine, they rejected the plan, arguing that their right to self-determination was being completely ignored.
And right there, that is the heart of the tragedy. The world tried to solve one people's unimaginable trauma by creating a brand new one for another. It was a collision of two valid but totally conflicting claims to the same land.
And in May 1948, Israel declared independence. For Jewish people around the world, it was a miracle, a safe haven after centuries of persecution.
But the very next day, 5 Arab armies invaded, seeking to destroy the newborn state. And for the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians living there, this war for Israel's survival would become a catastrophe.
So, May 1948, Israel declares independence. For Jewish people who had just survived genocide, it was a moment of profound joy and security.
But while one story was beginning with a celebration, another was ending in tragedy. That same moment marks the start of the Nakba. And you can't understand anything about what's happening today without understanding what that word means.
The Nakba, or the Catastrophe, saw over 750,000 Palestinians, more than half of the Arab population, pushed into exile. They were driven from their homes and their land by the war and by targeted military operations.
And it wasn't just the people who were exiled, it was their entire world. We're talking about more than 400 Palestinian towns and villages that were systematically destroyed, literally wiped off the map. Their names were changed to Hebrew, and in many places, forests were planted right over the ruins to hide what was once there. It was a deliberate act of cultural erasure.
For decades, the story you would hear was that the Palestinians just left, that they fled voluntarily, but that story has since fallen apart. A new generation of historians, including many Israelis, dug into newly declassified military archives. What they found was clear evidence of organized campaigns designed to drive people out of their homes through force and fear.
And this is where the injustice becomes permanent. The UN passed Resolution 194 giving the Palestinian refugees the right to return. But what's often forgotten is that 1948 created two refugee crises. At the exact same time Palestinians were being displaced, nearly 1 million Jews were being driven out of the surrounding Arab world. It was a year of profound trauma and displacement for both people.
But here's where their paths diverged dramatically. The Jewish refugees were absorbed into the new state of Israel, but for the Palestinians, their right of return, guaranteed by UN Resolution 194, was never implemented. This is the living, breathing reality that created the world's longest-standing refugee crisis.
And what happened next in the War of 1967 would cement that reality, trapping millions under a military occupation that continues to this day.
By 1967, tensions were at a breaking point. Egypt's President Nasser had closed a key Israeli shipping route and massed troops and tanks on Israel's border. Facing what it saw as an imminent threat of annihilation, Israel launched a preemptive strike.
And thus began the Six-Day War. In less than a week, Israel seized a massive amount of land: the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the Gaza Strip from Egypt.
And just like that, everything changed. Israel went from being a country to being a military occupier, controlling the lives of millions more Palestinians. And almost immediately, they started building settlements, which are exclusive communities for Israelis on Palestinian land, a practice that is illegal under international law.
But then fast forward to the 90s and a wild thing happens. It looks like peace might actually break out.
The Oslo Accords. It was a huge moment, a promise of a two-state solution. There was real hope, but extremists on both sides worked to destroy it. While Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank never stopped, Palestinian militant groups like Hamas launched a campaign of suicide bombings to sabotage the talks.
And tragically, the final blow to the peace process came from an Israeli extremist. In 1995, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, the man who signed the deal, was assassinated, not by a Palestinian, but by a right-wing Israeli who wanted to kill any chance of peace.
And he got his wish. Hope died. Palestinian frustration boiled over into the Second Intifada. The uprising unleashed a horrific wave of suicide bombings against Israeli civilians. And Israel's response? To build a massive 700-kilometer wall, cutting deep into Palestinian territory, annexing more land, and isolating towns and villages. They built a wall instead of a future.
They cut farmers off from their land, students from their schools, and families from each other, all in the name of security, but with devastating daily consequences.
Even the International Court of Justice ruled the wall illegal, but that didn't stop its construction. It just stopped the world from pretending peace was still possible.
And then came the blockade. Gaza, already under occupation, was now under siege, locked in, locked down, and left to suffer.
And this is where the story of modern Gaza really begins. In 2005, Israel disengages. It pulls its soldiers and 9,000 settlers out of the Strip.
It sounded like a step towards peace, but the power vacuum it created led to chaos. In 2007, after a violent civil war, Hamas took complete control of Gaza, ousting the Palestinian Authority. In response, Israel and Egypt sealed the borders, imposing a complete blockade.
And that blockade turned Gaza into a pressure cooker. For 18 years, 2 million people, half of them children, have been trapped in what the UN has called an unlivable open-air prison.
And every few years, this pressure cooker explodes. Hamas fires rockets into Israel, forcing families in nearby towns to live under constant threat of rocket fire.
And in response, Israel launches overwhelming military assaults. 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, the vast majority of them civilians, leaving Gaza little time to heal.
It's a cycle with no escape. Siege, assault, destruction, repeat. And that makes this history and our next steps all the more urgent.
That 18-year pressure cooker in Gaza is the essential context for what happened next, the absolute horror of October 7th.
Hamas launched a brutal, horrific terror attack. They killed 1,200 Israelis, took 250 hostages. It was a war crime, full stop.
For Israel, it was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust, a profound national trauma that completely shattered their sense of security.
In the chaos that followed, the Israeli government announced its goals: rescue the hostages and permanently dismantle Hamas so that an attack like this could never happen again.
But From the very beginning, there's been a massive conflict inside Israel about how to achieve those goals. The government has prioritized overwhelming military force,
while a huge portion of its own people have been in the streets demanding a different path. Tens of thousands protesting week after week, demanding a ceasefire to get the hostages home. We're talking university presidents, top writers, and even 500 retired generals and security chiefs have called for an end to the war.
So you had this massive rift, right? A government that feels it must continue the war at all costs, and a growing movement of its own citizens who believe the war itself is failing them and costing too many lives.
And look, everyone agrees that a country has the right to defend itself. That's a cornerstone of international law.
But the question the entire world is now asking is, when does defense become something else? When does it become a campaign of collective punishment against an entire population?
And that's why the language around this has escalated to the most serious terms possible. It's now being debated in the world's highest courts.
It started when South Africa brought a landmark case to the International Court of Justice, the UN's top court, accusing Israel of committing genocide. Since then, several other countries have formally joined that case.
And it's not just nations. The top UN independent experts now say there are reasonable grounds to believe genocide is being committed. And major human rights groups like Amnesty International have documented overwhelming evidence of what they call war crimes.
But while the legal debate over that one word, genocide, continues, there is one point of horrifying consensus. Virtually every humanitarian organization on the planet, including the UN itself, agrees that starvation is being used as a weapon of war, and that a man-made famine is killing children right now.
Because when you see hospitals and universities destroyed and children starving to death, the world has to ask the toughest questions. Is this just a war? Or is it a deliberate attempt to make life itself impossible in Gaza?
I know, it's overwhelming to hear all of this. The history, the politics, the legal arguments.
But that's why when you hear people say it's complicated, it's more important to remember this history. It's the story of one people's freedom coming at the painful expense of another's.
And that brings us back to the here and now. It's about humanity refusing to turn our backs on human suffering. When we say we can't look away, we mean it. Not just for Gaza, but for wherever humanity calls for standing up.
And there are other places the world looks away from too. Places like Myanmar, where the Rohingya families face ongoing genocides at the hands of a military regime, and to all those crushed under the junta's ongoing ethnic warfare. Canada led aid efforts to recognize genocide and imposed sanctions. Canadians have stood with Ukraine, with billions in aid, defense cooperation, and on-the-ground visits in Kyiv.
And then there's Sudan, where, in the worst child displacement crisis in the world, Canada imposed sanctions and co-sponsored a UN mandate for investigation. Yet millions are still starving, displaced, or detained. We've made sure that where civilians suffer, Canada responds. History isn't waiting, it's being written right now. You don't need to be a world leader to make a difference. What matters is that you refuse to turn away.
So share this video and talk to your family and friends. Demand that our leaders don't just recognize a state, but use every tool they have to fight for its freedom and for an end to the violence on both sides.
This has never been about being pro one side and anti the other. It's about being pro-humanity. It's about choosing when it matters most to be on the right side of history.